So let's get into some of these causative factors a little more in detail. A lot of things have changed with farms and advances in farming operations. They've become more efficient, and you can't blame farmers for doing this. You get higher profits when you have larger fields. You get rid of the hedgerows, you use bigger machinery, and we all know that this has happened over the years. They leave a lot less cover after the harvest. Usually they're going to put something else in right after, and there's not a lot of wasted time there where these lands are sitting around idle. There's fewer weeds, insects, and waste grain. A lot less food in a crop field now than there was 40 years ago. And people always talk about herbicides, and they say, well, do quail get it on their feet, and that's somehow absorbed through their skin, sort of an eagle DDT type mentality. There's really no evidence of that at all. I mean, there's not been anything documented regarding that, especially with the herbicides we have now that are, not exceptionally, harmful to wildlife. But they do have an indirect effect in reducing the amount of weeds and the insects that use those weeds. So you're going to have effects on chicks that need insects through the first part of their life. Development can cause direct loss of habitat. That's a pretty easy one to understand. And then something that's a little less obvious is the indirect loss through fragmentation of habitat. And I've got a slide that I'll talk about that a little more in detail. This was a place we first moved here. We were living in those apartments, and there was quail whistling right there, and behind the apartment complex. And since then, there's all kinds of strip malls and stuff there. So, where those birds go. Maturing forest, I mentioned, is something that we maybe don't really think about. This happens over time. It has a large impact on quail across the landscape. Succession is the natural change in vegetation through time. And every speaker, I think, has hit on that a little bit. Here's a series of slides. If you just took this bean field, you just let it go. Just let nature take its course. The next year, the year after, you'll have 2 to 3, 4 years where it looks somewhat like this. At first, you'll have more weeds and ragweed, foxtail, and things like that, and then you'll get into some more grasses like broom sedge. You're going through these successional stages. This is great quail habitat. It's a really easy way to get quail habitat on your property. Just let it alone. But like Dr. Bell said, you can't. It's a temporary thing. You have to go back in and do something, because in some places, this will happen in 2 or 3 years. You'll get sweet gums, red maples. Some places pines are going to encroach into that field, and I mean it's going to, once they take over, it's going to be a fast process in the soils that we have around here. And then at some point, 8 to 10 years into it, you're going to totally lose the quail habitat, and it's going to be more woodcock habitat. Okay, even this is probably a little too old for woodcock, but you're just going to be into a pole staged forest. This isn't a whole lot of good for much of anything. It's just a place for deer to walk through when they're going to the cornfield or something. There's not a whole lot of wildlife value here. And then over time, you'll develop into a mature forest, and completely eliminating the quail benefit here. They just will not use this type of habitat. There's tons of this in Maryland. Okay, let's talk about fragmentation a little bit. This is an important concept, and a lot of the recent research has really pointed to this as being a major factor in why quail have sort of gone extinct, basically, in certain places. And this is kind of a real-world example. This is a wildlife management area in Caroline County. And we thought we were doing a great thing, and it was good. We managed the habitat in these field blocks here. Okay, and these fields are only maybe 20 or 30 acre blocks. And we had several coveys of quail in each of these. We probably had 15 coveys of quail at one point in these chunks of good habitat. And this was about 10 years ago we started to manage this property. A key thing, though, is that, you know, two coveys of quail can't exist on their own. They just can't do it. They can't keep breeding with themselves. There has to be exchange from covey to covey. And when we followed these birds with radio transmitters on last fall, we found this. You know, there would be, you know, you kind of think that birds always, you know, it's a family unit, and they always stay together. There's actually a lot of mixing. You know, there's just times where a couple birds from this covey will just end up over with another covey. They go back and forth. Certain times a year they do this more. And you need to do this, you know, both just from mixing from like genetic perspective, and also when mortality, you know, really starts taking a toll on these coveys, and they get down below about 8 birds, they need to be able to find another covey to join up with, or the entire covey's going to, you know, be gone. They're a covey bird. They really aren't suited to living by themselves or just with a couple other individuals. So they have to be able to have this interaction. And what we had going for us, and the area in between here is actually some Chesapeake forest land. It's state property, but it's managed by the Forest Service. And they had some recent clear cuts in between all these patches of fields. It was an ideal situation. I mean, these clear cuts were, you know, 2, 3, 4 years old about the time we started to manage these blocks of fields. And we put in, you know, food plots and field borders and warm season grass plantings. Everything was working great, and we had all these quail. But over time, and it happens fairly quickly. You know, this is about a 10-year period. These have basically become unsuitable. They're totally, you know, just closed canopy pine forest, about 15 years old, and you know, there's nothing on the ground except pine needles. And these birds can't really maneuver through there without getting picked off by predators. So you've got a bird there that needs to disperse for whatever reason, and he tries to get across there, and you have some probably high mortality. We don't know this is happening. There's been studies done in Virginia, and they basically found if a quail decided to venture off the core area, the prime habitat area, and go through mature woodland, they weren't going to last more than a day. I mean, they just would not do it. And we kind of saw the same thing on our study. When they're in places where there's a lot of tall trees, mature trees with little ground cover, they don't last long at all. So basically the bottom line is we went from having a lot of quail there to virtually none. Even though we still have that good habitat out there, we're still managing it, we don't have that connection. So it's really important to think on this landscape level, have these corridors where birds can move around. Well, probably the most common thing that I get asked is, what about predators? And what's the role of predators in the decline of quail? And so I've just got a few slides. I call it myths and misconceptions. First one that I hear, you know, all the time: predators are the reason quail disappear. There's too many foxes. There's too many hawks. Yes, their numbers have increased. At the same time, the quail numbers have decreased. But you know, it's a proven thing that you know, a lot of quail and all game birds are going to die every year. You know, if only 50% of quail are killed by predators, you're doing pretty good. Most of the time, it's upwards of 80 or more % of the quail will get taken by predators every year. But, you know, they've coexisted for thousands of years. You know, they've evolved together, and they can really thrive where predators are abundant. I mean, there's places that have not done any predator management, and there's plenty of quail there. They're prolific breeders. You know, if you have good nesting and brood rearing cover, you know, they can produce a ton of birds. You know, they'll nest 2, sometimes 3 times a year, and can really pump out the birds with the proper habitat, and that's the real key there. Everybody also thinks foxes. You know, they won't blame everything on foxes. You know, they're visible, and you see foxes. And the fact is that, you know, they will take some adult quail, but the research has shown that nest predators, raccoons, possums, skunks, black rat snakes, have a much greater impact on quail numbers because they're eating a lot of nests. And on the eastern shore here, we actually have some of the highest documented black rat snake populations or densities in the whole country. And they eat a lot of quail eggs. So here's some photos down here. These are cameras put on nest sites in Virginia in habitat similar to what we have here. And they found raccoons, possums, skunks, even house cats and some other things eating quail nests. And we saw the same thing in our research project. We had a few fox calls, but primarily it was other species. The last myth that I put on here is trapping predators will result in more quail. That makes sense. If you trap predators, it'll be less out there to eat the birds. The research really shows, and there's been some really good work done on this, it will not increase quail numbers unless you have habitat in the first place. Even then, you need to trap a lot and consistently to increase quail abundance, even, you know, slightly. You're not going to go from 1 covey to 10 coveys because you trap predators. And you know, people that are interested in quail management, you know, go out there and trap these guys. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. You're going to be helping your birds. Don't have unrealistic expectations and think that it's going to, you know, be the only thing you need to do, or it's going to, you know, double or triple the number of quail out there, because it's not. Okay, after we get done clearing people up about predators, the next thing is, what about pen-raised quail? You know, why can't we just release them? And there's a lot of, I don't know, I think our turkey program has kind of hurt us in this regard, because we'll say, well, you just release turkeys, you know, just do that with quail. You know, there's some big differences there. You know, we took wild turkeys, moved them around the state. Releasing a pen-raised quail just isn't a similar or comparable thing. This is another study done in Virginia. They have a lot more money than us to study this stuff. They released 120 pen-raised quail, 120 pen-raised wild quail crosses. So they bred them one generation in captivity, and 40 quail that they just trapped in one part of the state and moved them and followed them. All of their pen-raised quail died within 9 days. You know, and this is it's a pretty striking thing. There are landowners that have had success getting their pen-raised quail to survive longer than that. But the fact is that rarely can you really show that those birds live to reproduce and help, you know, the quote wild population. You know, and we have no problems with people interested in quail, interested in hunting quail. Go out there, put some birds out. If you have a system, and there's some systems developed now where you can get those birds to live for, you know, a few weeks, a few months if you do it right, and you have a good hunting opportunity there. But shoot them all, because they're not going to live to reproduce anyway. The guys that are going out just dumping quail out in hopes that they restore the population are, you know, really wasting your time and money in most situations.